Hey everyone, I'm Alex, and this is Big Al Books. Today I'm here to do my March wrap-up, and if you've been following my channel throughout the month of March, you know that I've been pretty busy this month participating in the March of the Mammoths Readathon. This was a readathon where a community of readers were choosing books that were over 800 pages in length. The idea was to choose one large and intimidating book and to try to make as much progress as you could throughout the month. Jason over at the channel Old Blues Chapter and Verse came up with the idea for this readathon partly as a way to honor the slower paced readers of our community, because sometimes we can all get caught up in this booktube craze where it looks like consuming a large amount of books per month is the norm, which of course it's not. We all read at different paces, we all have different obligations with our time, and every month is going to be different for every reader. So this readathon was not really about completing a lot of challenges and speed reading from one book to the next, but it was more about diving into something large and intimidating. And I found this to be an immensely rewarding experience. Usually as a reader, I like to bounce back and forth between multiple books. I like finishing things quickly and then just diving into my next read right away. And what I've discovered is that there's a certain kind of instant gratification in that. There's a certain dopamine rush that comes from starting and finishing books. Like, it is really the most exciting part. So when you're just constantly starting things and finishing things, it just feels like your reading is always exciting. When I switched over to only reading long books in the month of March, I almost had to reprogram my expectations as a reader, and it certainly challenged my attention span at times, where I couldn't just keep expecting those hits of dopamine from starting and finishing. Instead, there are some very long and dry passages of long books. Of course, not every line needs to be there. However, there is something really powerful about the experience of being deeply immersed in a text. It really makes you feel like you are living in that world. You become so much more attached to the characters, and when the ending finally does happen, I found that the emotional payoff was so much stronger than in a book that I had just casually flipped through in a few days. So overall, this was a really great reading experience. I have 4 Mammoth books to talk to you about, and if you've watched some of my update videos throughout the month, then you already know what these books are, but I will try my best not to repeat myself too much in this video. The first book that I ended up finishing this month was also my longest read of the month by far, and that was Les Miserables by Victor Hugo. This is the translation by Christine Donagher, and this edition comes in at 1,416 pages, which might make this the longest book that I've ever read in my life. I think previously War and Peace held that honor, but I think that this is even a little bit longer than that one. But just as weighty and philosophical and such a satisfying read, I ended up loving this book, which came as a surprise to me because this was a book that was never really high on my priority list until I started getting more into French classics last year. I thought, well, I should eventually give Victor Hugo a chance, but I knew that there was this very sentimental musical based off of this book, and I just didn't predict that it would be one that I would get so fully swept away in the story. So I had such a fantastic time reading this book, and there was something really special about experiencing this story for the first time. I really knew very little about this story except for the basic premise at the beginning, so I found that I was always in this constant state of suspense and excitement. I really cared about the characters, and I wanted to know what was going to happen to them and if they were going to be okay, because they get themselves involved in so many stressful situations. So I just loved being along for the ride for this one. It was quite the emotional roller coaster for me. The other thing that is very cool about this book is that it's kind of a huge mess. You know, sometimes you read a book and you feel like it is such a masterpiece because it has been so artfully constructed and every word is so precisely chosen and it just seems like it all fits together so beautifully. But this is not one of those books. Victor Hugo just seemed to write whatever the heck he wanted to. There was no sense of kill your darlings or take out the parts that you like the best in order to spare the reader. Wasn't really thinking about that. He is a true maximalist and he just kept it all in there. So this book can be a bit of a mess as a result of that. Anyone who has survived this book knows the long sections of discourse that he peppers throughout his narrative, which are very frustrating for the reader because he can write a really good plot when he wants to, and there's lots of momentum, and you're so excited about what's going to happen, and then he just slams on the brake and decides to go into some kind of digression about history for like 60 pages. So this was one of those books where I could see like it had a lot of flaws, and there were a lot of things in this book that actively irritated me. Like I got angry at multiple points reading this book, and yet somehow all of that ended up making me more emotionally attached to this book. It's almost like it's easier to love something that's imperfect. When something is truly flawless, it seems almost distant and not human. So for me as a reader, I can somehow latch onto these imperfect books in an even stronger kind of way. So I find it incredible that I had so many grievances with this book, but when it came down to it at the end, I just loved it so much that I cannot deny this book, even though it has a lot of faults. It's kind of like a family member that you just always bicker with. You know, they drive you crazy, but at the end of the day, they're just true family, and you love them no matter what. So I kind of had one of those experiences with this book. Another reason why I think I really love this book is that it came into my life at just the right moment where I really needed a story like this. Because this is a book that is just so much about optimism in the human spirit and progress, that we can be kinder and more compassionate, that our society can be a more fair and just place. I don't want to get too political here, but in the province of Ontario where I live, we have a new provincial government that are proposing to make some pretty significant changes to our education system, and since I'm a relatively new teacher in the system, this is likely going to have some pretty serious impacts on the future of my career, as well as on the quality of education that's going to be provided to my students. So the month of March has been a pretty disheartening time for educators where I am. We're getting a lot of bad news, there's a lot of confusion and uncertainty in the air, and just reading a book like this is just really powerful in those kind of times of trouble. I found this book to be very personally inspiring. There are many passages in here about the value and importance of education in creating a just society, as well as there's a lot of passages in here about revolution, about people banding together and standing up for what they believe in, even if it comes at great personal cost. So all of those passages were really inspiring for me, and ultimately the optimistic tone of this book was something that I really needed to hear. So it was just really nice to read something very life-affirming and inspiring. So I think that's part of the reason why I had such a strong personal connection to this book. I truly loved it, and it was such a perfect read for this month. My nonfiction mammoth-sized read of the month was The Brontes by Juliet Barker. This was so cool. First of all, because I love reading the works of the Bronte sisters, and it was just so much fun to get to know more about them and their life and their whole family. But the other cool thing that I loved about this is that it's not just your traditional biography that's just giving you information about people's lives, but rather it seemed like Juliet Barker had this real chip on her shoulder. She is a woman on a mission in this book. She is trying to set the record straight and clear up all of the myths and rumors and outright fabrications that have permeated the history of the Bronte family, and you have to admire the work that she's done here. If you go through these literal hundreds of pages of endnotes in the back, you can see that she has painfully gone through so many different sources to try to find the accurate information, and you have to respect that. Barker does a great job of clearing up some historical inaccuracies. She seems to be particularly on a mission to save the reputation of Patrick Bronte, the father of the family, who was much maligned in Elizabeth Gaskell's Charlotte Bronte biography. So you really do spend a lot of time with Patrick in this book, and you can't help but admire the feisty old guy. So even though I went into this book knowing very little about him, I found him to be quite a fascinating character. The biography tends to center around Patrick and Charlotte, since those are the two who lived the longest, had the most public lives, and left behind the most correspondence. So it's kind of natural that those are the two that we just know the most about, but I have to say that my favorite parts were those little shadowy, slim fragments of material that we had about Brenwell, Emily, and Anne. And I'm just so interested in those three and how they were writing things that were so creative and different from what was going around at the time. So I really enjoyed learning more about this family. If you're a Bronte fan, I think that you're really going to enjoy this book. It can be sometimes tedious in the amount of detail. Like sometimes there are these like long paragraphs that are going to describe the architecture of a church, which maybe isn't your thing, but I couldn't help but appreciate all of the hard work that Barker put into this very detailed and intricate portrayal of a very fascinating family. I don't think this book is a great gateway into the world of the Brontes. It is very specific, so it's probably one that is best enjoyed by people who are already fans of the literary works of the Brontes and just want to learn more about this really incredible and strange family. My third mammoth read of the month was The Luminaries by Eleanor Catton. This book was 830 pages, and it was by far the most fast-paced of all the mammoth reads that I read this month, so I did appreciate it for that. Unfortunately, this book didn't sweep me up in the way that I was hoping it was going to. This is a book that is set in New Zealand during the gold rush years and is kind of centered around this mystery. I had a bit of a hard time getting into this book. It was putting me to sleep pretty consistently every night when I was reading it, and I was just hoping that it was going to get more exciting as I got more invested in the mystery and in solving what was going to happen. But it's not really a book that is about that. It is not like a straight up mystery with a satisfying payoff, so I don't think you should go into this book expecting that. I think it is a bit more of a character study. The strange thing about it is that even though the writing about the characters in this book is like extremely detailed and specific, and it's very generous in the amount of information you receive about the characters, it still somehow failed to really bring them to life for me. Since there are so many main characters in this book, I just found that most of them kind of faded into the background, and no one really stood out as a truly memorable person that I was really invested in learning their story in this book. So this one was a bit of a miss for me, and in some ways, I maybe should have expected it. I knew going into this book that it was going to be heavily influenced by astrology, and that the cycle of the moon influences the structure of this book, and that there are astrological connections with the characters, and there are all these like star charts in this book. But really, I have zero interest in astrology, and I think part of that comes from the fact that I'm bitter about my star sign. So I guess I'm not really interested in astrology, and I really wasn't curious after finishing this book about looking more into it and how it cleverly affected the structure of the book. I'm sure there were great connections, but I just wasn't really interested in looking for that. The other thing is that historically, I haven't really done great with reading books about gold rushes. One that came to mind that I've read recently was The Sisters' Brothers by Patrick DeWitt. This was a book about two brothers that are again trying to strike gold in California, and again, it was kind of a book where I didn't feel like there was anything wrong with it, but I just really didn't care about the story or connect with any of the characters. And I feel like it was sort of the same thing going on with The Luminaries. Now, I will say that I had an enjoyable time reading this book in the moment, but my issue with it was that it just didn't build up to anything particularly satisfying. So there's something about this book that just wasn't very striking or memorable for me, and I feel like it's a book that in a few months I probably won't be able to tell you any of the characters' names or many details about their lives. So it's just one of those books that didn't really stick with me, and it was fine. I'm glad that I gave it a chance, but just wasn't particularly suited to my tastes. My last mammoth-sized read of the month was a true novel by Minae Mizamura. This was translated from the Japanese by Julie Winters Carpenter. It did seem like a particularly smooth translation that still captured a lot of mood and atmosphere, so I think that Julie did a really great job with this work. The other cool thing about this book is that it's split into two, which I really appreciated after carrying around gigantic books all month. I really needed the break on my wrist. The strange thing about this book is that it's printed on like really glossy photo paper almost, which is strange for a paperback. But what's really nice is that there are a lot of these black and white photos peppered throughout the text that just give you a little bit of context about some of the places near the book. This is a book that is deeply immersed in a sense of time and place. When the novel opens, we're introduced to a character whose family has moved over to America, but she's deeply nostalgic for Japan and the homeland and the culture that she's left behind, and you can kind of feel that sense of nostalgia in how she writes about the scenes set in Japan, in the countryside during these post-war years. The main reason that I picked up this book is that I heard that it was some kind of retelling of Wuthering Heights, which I found very intriguing since that's one of my favorite books, and In some ways, that's sort of true. You can recognizably see the story of Heathcliff and Cathy. However, this book radically departs from that story in many major kind of ways. I think especially with the pacing of the story. To be fair, Wuthering Heights doesn't get going right off the jump. It is framed as more of a story within a story. A true novel is a bit more of a story within a story within a story. So it really takes its time in getting going, which you think would be frustrating, but for some reason it really wasn't. Like pretty much most of book one, which is 450 pages, is really just setting the stage for the kind of Heathcliff and Cathy narrative to really take off. In the first half of this book, Mizamura is not doing anything particularly engaging with the plot to keep the reader invested, and yet for some reason I was just slowly sucked into this book through the mood. I was just interested in reading about the natural landscape and just the characters and the stories that they were telling about their memories of the past. I don't know. I can't say why it worked, but it did. And then you get into the second half of the book, which contains that more stormy and passionate love affair that I was expecting to see from Wuthering Heights. So it's fun to compare the two novels, but you really can't go in expecting them to achieve the same sort of things. And I guess that was part of my problem, is that I'm just such a big fan of Wuthering Heights and what it does, and everyone in that book is just so terrible for the most part, and people are so twisted, and it's really about revenge, whereas this book is just a lot more subdued than that. It really isn't the kind of same over-the-top revenge tale. So if you are coming in as a huge Wuthering Heights fan, you're not going to find those elements in that book. Even though there are some shared similarities in plot, this is really its own whole thing, with a very different, much slower paced and more somber and nostalgic mood. So I think people who maybe do not like the dramatic excess of Wuthering Heights will much prefer the way that a true novel handles this story. So in some ways, I can almost see this novel working better for people who really don't enjoy Wuthering Heights, or people who haven't read Wuthering Heights and don't have anything to compare it to. So while I didn't find this book to be as emotionally intense as I was hoping it to be, it still was very captivating in its own way. I enjoyed every moment of the story. I quite liked the nostalgic tone of this book as it was describing the different ups and downs of Japan's economy and how that connected to the fates and the relationships between the different characters in this book. So I thought it was very immersive, and there was some really good storytelling going on in here. So I am really glad that I gave this one a go. Though it can't hold a candle to Wuthering Heights for me, there is still something that is very fun about seeing that story that I'm so familiar with and displacing it, putting it into a new setting, into a new culture, and seeing how that story might play out in a different environment. So I had a really great time reading this book. Also, I was able to finish this book on March 31st at 11:50 p.m. So this book was a great choice to get me through the final week of this readathon and to carry me through right to the finish line. So that's it for the 4 books that I read in March. Like I mentioned before, I had such a great time slowing down my reading this month, really focusing on some immersive reads, and I'm so glad that I participated in the March of the Mammoths Readathon. Thank you so much to Jason and Lukas for inviting me to co-host with you. I had such a good time, although I will say that I'm happy to have my freedom back again. I feel like the genie that's been released from the lamp, and I can go anywhere and read anything that I want. I'm going back into all of my old habits. I'm reading about 7 books at once right now, but I'm having a good time. I'd love to know what you read during the month of March. One of the best things about co-hosting this readathon has been really getting a chance to interact more with the community. I feel like I've made some great new connections with people this month through comments talking about the mammoth-sized reads that we've been picking up. So I'd love to hear more. Were you able to finish your mammoth? Did you make some good progress? Or if you weren't participating in March of the Mammoths, let me know if you read anything good this month. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you again later.